Good to go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Senate Education Wednesday, March 29th, 3:15. We just returned from the floor, and we have one agenda item today. It will take us about 45 minutes or so. PCB testing in schools. And we have Dr. Levine with us and Commissioner Belling from the Department of Environmental Conservation. Just to review with us, Dr. Levine, if you would, some PCBs in general, testing protocols, kind of bring us back to where this committee has had a little bit of this conversation this year, and I know committee members have questions. So sort of an information gathering afternoon.
Super.
Perfect. Well done.
So what I will do in a very brief time is talk a little bit about health, because I have to.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the Vermont framework, if you will, for testing, and why it's based on air, and why we believe we should not pause testing.
Okay.
Does that sound
Reasonable.
reasonable?
Thank you.
Here we go. So this is just an overview of health. I'll go into some minimal detail, but the overlying concept is PCBs are bad. They cause serious health problems, and we shouldn't doubt that years after we actually created the legislation to do the testing. We have studies on animals that are very clear. We have reports from humans that show outcomes that are seen in animals happen in humans as well. And though they don't call these forever chemicals like the PFOA compounds, they are in your body a very long time, very long half-life, if you will. So if you're a young person and you get exposed, it can translate into developing baby exposure years down the road.
Your infant,
Exactly.
Yes, okay. And just so everyone knows, this is in our pile. In our packet.
And some of these health effects can be interrelated, as I'll show you. So just, you saw the cancer. Melanoma is the one that has been most conclusively recognized as a causal relationship. Breast and liver and lymphoma of the Hodgkin's type are also a concern. When you think you hear in the media some controversy about are these bad or not, it's because various organizations label them differently. So the EPA calls it as a probable human carcinogen, which is a pretty high level for them. The IARC just comes out and says it is carcinogenic. The National Toxicology Program says that it's reasonable to conclude that these are carcinogens in humans. And the weakest one is NIOSH, which says potential occupational carcinogens. But we also really dwell on the non-cancer effects of these substances. And that's in the immune, reproductive, endocrine, and neurologic systems. So the immune system's obviously, how do we fight foreign invaders into our body? There's a bunch of things on the slide. I'm not going to go into detail except to say that these do act as suppressants of your immune system. And if you remember from COVID, anytime you're somewhat suppressed in your immune system, you're at risk. And so we think this is possibly linked to why cancer is also impacted because of the impact on the immune system. Looking at the reproductive system, the take-home messages are that there have been studies showing decrease in birth weight and increase in the amount of premature. The next two are more developmental, meaning they can be in the fetus or in the infant. So we'll start with the central nervous system. Like other things we've talked about in this committee that you're concerned about in school, like impact on short-term memory, impact on attention, impact on learning, visual recognition. The PCBs have been associated with problems in those arenas. again, an interrelation from other effects. And then I don't want to get too heavy into thyroid hormone and endocrinology, but suffice it to say that especially with regards to normal development in the fetus and in the infant, thyroid hormone can be involved. And if this impacts the level of thyroid hormone, it can adversely affect those things. Because the thyroid hormone is our sort of metabolic hormone involved with growth of the bowel. So that's the health part, just to get us on the same foundation.
Does anyone have any questions about the health part, concerns, disagreements? I think we'll just pause here right now and see if Senator Williams, did you have a question?
That's weird.
I'm sorry, Senator Williams.
It's my name.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions.
Yeah,
Okay,
good.
thanks.
Next, I want to impress upon you how they impact us. PCBs are throughout our environment, even though they've been banned since 1979. Do last a long time. We get them often through our diet, fatty foods, so fatty fish, meats, and unfortunately in Vermont, dairy products. Normally, that creates a background level for everyone, so that we have to be careful in looking at levels of exposure and levels of screening to make sure we account for the fact that the background level is not zero throughout the country. But here I want to get you focused on air, because the biggest source of exposure for students and staff in buildings that have older construction, which is the majority of our school system, unfortunately, meaning before 1980, it's through the air. Leaching from materials that were used in construction, whether they're caulking materials, whether they're paints, whether they're in the fluorescent ballasts, which hopefully they're not so much in our schools because there was a whole project years back to deal with that. So air is really the thing that is where the biggest exposure is. And like anything else, it's a matter of how often, how much, how long to determine the individual's risk.
Sir, if I could, just out of curiosity, so can you comment though on PCB presence in water and soil? Is it an item of concern?
Yes,
or-
it is. That's probably where the fish are getting it. However, that's not the way humans are getting to the level where these health effects will be seen. It's usually through the
Yes, Senator.
Anything from the waste stream, like the sewage treatment facilities,
in terms of
PCBs getting into the water?
getting it into the water. My colleague here,
I'm sure there is some, that's more of a PFAS concern these days. We have it, I mean, PCBs are pretty ubiquitous in the environment, so I wouldn't be surprised I could find out where they're showing up in that type of waste stream, but they're not unusual. You find them in soils throughout the state, so.
Senator.
Just probably another question for you. So PCBs, are they at all naturally occurring, or are they ubiquitous in soil and water just because we've manufactured them so much and they've just been dispersed?
So I should say for the record, John Beeling, Department of Environmental Conservation Commissioner, there are manufactured.
I thought so, but I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
So this, what I'm going to present to you now doesn't make it into the media very often. Usually it's sort of saying, why is Vermont so unique? Why are we different than EPA? All of that kind of stuff. But as you can see in the title to the slide, Vermont levels are based on EPA levels and the framework that EPA set out. The difference is it's using current research. The EPA findings were set in 1994. Doesn't mean they haven't looked at them since, it's just they haven't revised their framework since. And that's an important point. The team at my environmental health division and health department that helped work on these, along with colleagues across state government, also work with EPA in the development of these and with consultants and very knowledgeable experts around the country. for which there are not very many, I might add, because this is a fairly specialized field in toxicology. So we've got a screening level of 15. That's just sort of that raises our eyebrow level. It's really the action levels that are where we need to focus. And we have two sets of levels. We have school action levels and immediate action levels. School action levels, as you might imagine, are higher than the screening level, but lower than the immediate action level. The immediate action level is get out of that room. You can't use that room because it's a toxic environment. I would say that, yes, our action levels, as the slide illustrates, are lower than that of EPA. That shouldn't be a cause for concern or alarm. And I'll bring you back to the PFAS set of compounds once again. In 2016, when Bennington learned that they had the misfortune of this problem, the EPA level was 400 parts per trillion. That was all that existed. We took a different approach and said, well, that isn't going to be very health protective. So to be health protective, we went down to a level of 20. Within a few months of us going to 20, EPA went from 400 to 70. And within a few months of that, I don't know how many states, but many other states adopted levels that were equal to Vermont or actually stricter than Vermont. So we're often pioneers, and I'd like you to look at us as looking at the science, being driven by the science, and not sort of being cowboys just saying, here's what we're doing, because it's a very informed process. EPA regulates a number of chemicals under a program called TSCA, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act. And the partner chemicals are, it's not good company to be in. It's formaldehyde, it's lead, it's asbestos, it's mercury, and it's the PFAS set of compounds. Now, for many of these, there are easier ways to avoid exposure. We talked about don't drink the water, use bottled water, whatever. It's hard to tell children don't breathe while you're in class. So this made us have to be even more serious about the task at hand. We used some of that information that I showed you about developmental neurotoxicity that I just referred to really use the current science in developing our levels, and that is why they are lower than the EPA's. Most of the time, we set a level of cancer risk of 1 in a million. That's kind of a standard in the field. And that was where we came from when we were starting to develop our action levels. Our colleagues in DEC helped us determine that even a level of 22.5 might be something that you might mix up with a background level because of the trashing of the environment and the contributions of food and what have you. And if you regulate down to that level, you're going to be chasing your tail a lot because you're never going to find a source of PCBs in the environment because it may not be the environment, it may be the background level that's actually the problem. That's why our action levels are a little bit higher than the level you saw on the slide. The immediate action level is almost by definition 3 times the lower action level. So that's where that comes from. Keep in mind, we're not just using cancer, we're using the non-cancer index.
This is a pretty key slide. So thank you for offering this. Just curious, so the 1994 levels established in your professional opinion, do those need to be revisited or
By the EPA?
By the EPA, that's right.
For sure. And it's not that they're asleep at the wheel. They have a team of scientists, in fact, that we use as consultants who are much up to date. It's just the process of changing the regulatory structures and the policies lies behind it.
Okay, given the potential cost of school renovations and potentially following on to workplace renovations and home renovations,
Yep.
do you feel that the EPA is motivated enough to?
I can tell you they're watching Vermont very closely because they were very involved with the Burlington High School decision and with the work site. They were consulting on the site because of all the findings there. And so they're very focused on this. At the same time, some of their setting of levels involved residential and how much time you sleep in a home. Ours are actually much more focused on the school and how much time a staff member or a student is present in a given room or in a given building, which is where that is going.
And just curious, these thresholds, are these adult thresholds or?
They
or is it-
are,
does it-
no, they are age dependent. So 30 would be for a preschool, 100 would be for a high school or adult. The reason for that has to do with the contribution of the nutritional factors to the underlying baseline in those groups and the amount of weight each has. So a very, very young person, the impact per gram of body weight is going to be different than for an adult.
Thanks.
And as you'll see, when we make decisions about who can be in a room, we use the age-specific levels. So this slide doesn't tell you anything you don't know. The state's paying for testing. What was Act 74, I believe, was the act that legislature came up with. And in that, we test about a third of the rooms in the school. Because of that, you need to develop grouping strategies because many rooms in the school have the same risk, same building materials, same essentially, one classroom looks like another in many cases, but that may look very different than the auditorium or the gym or the kitchen. So you need to be able to group like with like because that's part of the strategy for what are you going to do if a room is found that exceeds the thresholds and can you still put students in other rooms? So we'll show that in the next couple slides, which I think will illustrate for you what happens. Keep in mind, because questions always come up, this is the strategy developed and the law developed long after the Burlington High School issue. And it's hard to make comparisons between what happened there and what happens in current testing because there was no grouping strategy, there was no protocol for testing, there wasn't even a percentage of rooms tested. It was not done in that manner because it was done with the interest of getting to a new construction, just doing the testing that was required to move them to new construction or renovation. Renovations. So this picture, just imagine, and it's not imaginary made up, it's consultants developed this. All the green rooms are the same.
Are what?
The green rooms
Are
the same.
same.
They're all similar building materials, similar, sort of like this committee room looking like the one next door to it. And there are no extraneous factors that would make one a higher risk one than another. Same for the yellow, the blue, the red. So obviously, these triangles that are in there in yellow, those are the rooms that are actually tested. And it's not every green room. So that if green rooms all end up looking pretty similar on the testing, it means that the rooms that were tested are probably going to have looked that way too. Whereas obviously there's only 2 red rooms, they're both tested and you can't extrapolate beyond that for anything. So that's how we sort of set that up. When you do the testing, you get results back. Obviously, any result over that immediate action level means that room can't be used, period. But since that doesn't happen the majority of the time, if there are exceedances in the school action level, the 30 to 100 range, we've been able to create a protocol with our colleagues that allows several options. The options basically either provide restricted or unrestricted use of the rooms, and they do it for specific numbers of hours per week. It allows, the goal is, and this is important, especially coming off the pandemic, that it allows students and faculty to continue to be housed in the school building, knowing that the whole building is not at risk, but there are portions of the building that are. And so the goal is keep students in-person learning, don't close schools, and arrive at an accommodation that allows the school and the consultants to figure out the sources, start with the mitigation strategies, and move on from there. So I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but basically the lowest risk option restricts the use of the rooms to certain numbers of hours, depending on what age student is in the room and what number of hours they're there. But they have a year to actually fix things without any undue excess exposure to them. Whereas if you go to the higher risk on the right side of the slide, basically the rooms can be used in an unrestricted way, but there's a very limited time frame, usually like 6 weeks, and you need to basically have mitigation underway and do retesting and all of that in a very rapid fashion. So we try to meet the school where they are, and where and at what level that community is willing to accept risk, while mitigation will be ongoing.
So while we're on that slide,
And-
just so we all know, so if a test would come back in a certain school, it doesn't mean the school closes tomorrow.
It hasn't yet to date.
Okay, and those decisions are being left to whom? So one room is tested and it's at a low risk. The school then, in conjunction with its board, superintendent would make a decision, I'm assuming, to say, this is low risk, we're going to continue to operate,
Exactly.
but this classroom, for obvious reasons, will not be used at this point.
Right.
Okay,
Because there's mitigation, I don't know if you're going to get into mitigation versus remediation, but there's mitigation strategies that can be immediately implemented that might really be game changers. And then there's ultimate remediation strategies that may come along at a time when the school's not in session, like in the summertime or what have you, that can be implemented. The school sees this report, which basically tells them what the result was in every room and what rooms were tested, what rooms weren't tested. And then based on those results, here are their options. So you can see that for room 203, there's basically no use of that room because the level was so high in option 1. However, it wasn't so high that it caused an immediate action level threshold, so that some of the other options can be still used, but there's a 6-week timeline on them, and there's strategies that have to be implemented concurrently.
Senator Weeks.
So this report is this public information once it
Oh,
comes
yeah.
out? Okay.
There's a letter that goes to school and community, but then beyond that, there are meetings that are actually held with members of DEC, members of the health department, and school. I'm not sure we've had them publicly yet because we've offered them, but they haven't necessarily taken advantage of it. But there's a clear set of guidelines. Just wanted to bring back in the last 2 slides the perspective that, number one, everybody knows these are a problem, but not everyone's paying as much attention as we are. And there are countries like Sweden where all public buildings have to remove PCBs. That's sort of that extreme. The other extreme is some of the headlines that are in the slide showing that problems are being found, but they're not necessarily being addressed, and putting communities at risk, if you will. But in that role of being the only state addressing it, being the pioneers, you might imagine we come under a bit of fire now and then. And you might imagine people are like, well, looking very closely at the way we do things. And that's why I took some pains to show you that. But it's not been done before. So We hope we're getting it right. Perhaps getting it right means even doing more than we're doing. We'll find that along the way. But certainly we think we have a very well-designed and thoughtful design to addressing the problem. Which brings me to my last slide, which basically says, as again, I want to reinforce, PCBs are harmful. We want to keep our schools and our communities healthy, and that's a priority. And avoid any of those cancer or non-cancer related risks that we talked about. There are schools that have already been tested. If we did create a pause, as I know is under discussion in the legislature, that would be an equitable thing because the schools that have been tested are already embarked on their path of trying to remediate and improve the situation. And we've identified problems in enough schools that why would we not allow the others to benefit in the same way? I think I've shown you that this is a program that is protected for students and has been thoughtful. And I would hate to see us spend time and resources on reevaluating the program and redesigning it once again. But the most important point, of course, is bolded, which is if you pause testing, people will still be exposed to harmful chemicals and be at risk for the serious health effects that we discussed. To further illustrate this, I can tell you that we just informed the school this week of their results. And they had a decent number of rooms that went over the school action level, but 3 particular rooms that went over the immediate action level. So we are, today is Wednesday, we are meeting with them tomorrow. They've already got letters about that grid that I showed you, ways to utilize the rooms they have so that all the students can still learn in their school without vacating the school by any means. But it's happening real time right now that we're protecting students and the staff that work there. So this is not some hypothetical. It's happening as we speak. So I will stop there.
I think everybody has a question, so let's go around the room. Senator Hewitt, you want to
I
start?
mean, I have a series of questions, so if you do only have one.
Senator
Mike,
You
Schumer.
only
quick,
have one at a time.
Yeah.
I have a comment or a question for you, Chair. Can we find out from the House what their justification is for this? Because, I mean, I'll just say I don't want to pause PCB testing. But I'd like to understand, what background they have. I feel like maybe you might know, so.
Sure, and we can have them in. So this is coming from the House, the pause.
Yeah.
I had a meeting. I was at least in a meeting with the Pro Tem's office, who is not interested in pausing in terms of Senate leadership. I just want that
Good.
for the record at this point. Doesn't mean that it won't happen, but Senate leadership isn't interested in having it paused. Sees what we would benefit out of a 6-month period is a logical question, and people would continue to be exposed. Thank you, Dr. Levine, and we can go around and take additional questions. This has been very helpful. Who would like to go next? Everybody has questions, so Senator.
You sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, would you mind if I spoke to Senator Sheen's question first?
No, of course not. Yeah.
Okay, I believe the genesis of this, this idea in House Education is that given that we are looking at a more comprehensive school construction program, it is worrisome that we might be putting funds, a lot of money, taxpayer money, into remediating PCBs, mitigating PCBs, potentially renovating a room or a part of the building, only to then find, when we do this broader project, that perhaps a whole wing of a school needs to be renovated or a school needs to be completely demolished and rebuilt. And so that could be wasteful.
So isn't, just a response to that, isn't part of the school construction study to take into consideration how to also look at PCB remediation at the same time? Because we don't want to keep them separate because of what you're describing.
But I mean, they are separate.
And my response is that this testing protocol informs the schools that want to do renovation. And in fact, one thing I didn't mention is we prioritized certain schools to be tested first. A lot of it had to do with if they've had renovation in the recent past, or if they were planning it for the near future, if they had construction in certain years, if they had a whole host of different criteria. But the bottom line was renovation was on the list. So I look at it in reverse. This process informs renovation as opposed to why not wait to see what the schools are doing and then do the testing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too much in the House position. We'll let them come in. So I would say just represent your.
No, it's the same question.
Okay.
It's-
No.
Isn't part of this so based on the lag and the testing rollout? That we won't have enough information to inform the construction study?
Well, if they want to have admitted information in 2 months, yes.
Right, so that's, I think that's part of the point, that
Yeah.
the current program is lagging. And the expanded program, puts it out, puts it years out into the future. So that's a problem.
And there may be schools we weren't aware of that have renovation plans in the nearer future, but we did use that as a criteria, so we think that they told us what they told us.
Yeah.
So I'll just stick with this theme for now, but then I have other themes. So and it's nice to see you again, Dr. Levine. You spoke to us in health and welfare a while back. So to Senator Weese's point, if we have a school that urgently needs some work because it's got a sewer system that is not working, a roof that is not insulated, these are examples that we were given at one point, and needs some fairly substantial upgrades. But again, this program, we're looking years out. This isn't like instantaneous. So what happens to a school that has high levels of PCBs and a gym, let's say, or an auditorium? Do their students for the next 5, 6, 7 years, they can't use the gym? They don't get the exercise that they need on a regular basis? They don't have theater and music and band because they can't access those spaces? They don't have the money to remediate. So what, and
Yeah,
maybe
so
you
part of
don't,
that gets into the
Okay.
next part of the
okay,
conversation with DEC, because it's really what mitigation can be put into place based on what the findings are. What the consultants then come in and say is adequate versus no, you need to do this in addition. And that's a bit of unknown, so it's challenging. You're right, if a school has a multifunction room and we can't find a substitute room for all of those activities, that's a big challenge.
Yeah.
Our hope is that it's true most of the time and that there are other ways to get around. I have to also mention, though it's not plausible in every community, that part of the strategy is also to look within the community so that if there's something that could be done in another building that's not the actual school building, the community knows that that's available to them and it's safe for that use.
okay. Just to follow up, I think we mentioned in here, we touch upon the various crises that our school system, our public school system, probably some of our independent schools as well are facing around a variety of issues: funding, staffing, mental health, vaping, one that
Yes.
is near and dear to my heart at this moment. But all of these are huge issues. I am concerned when we have this discussion that, dealing with this problem is going to require staffing. It's going to require money. It's going to require taxpayer participation and jumping on board. And so these are all things, when you mentioned that we have a clear set of guidelines, okay, fair enough. But in terms of like the program itself, how robust is it and how helpful is it going to be to our communities? Because as of right now, the testimony that I've heard from Cabot School, what I've lived in Burlington, which I know was pre-program, but Cabot School, et cetera, is that this program, it's not robust. And folks are really struggling. So we can leave that on the table for now. I did have some other questions I was hoping to ask.
Yeah, no, I would just say that, I think everything problems often boil down to communication. And communication may have been an issue at the time of Cabot in a bi-directional way. And an orderly progression of things didn't occur there, which caused, I think, significant anxiety, which is problematic. Not to minimize Cabot's problems, but that's what I'm looking for is there, the results in Cabot were actually things that can be done. They did not have any immediate action level findings. They were all school action level findings. And they were in classrooms, so that's obviously a concern. Making sure you can still put students into classrooms that are safe. And the last I knew, they're still working on mitigation kind of strategies. But I look at that as maybe something earlier in the whole process, that we just needed to get the order of communications set better and the way the public gets informed set better.
So that's great. So you feel as though it's
I
improving.
think that was a learning.
That's great. Okay, thank you for that. Around PCBs, and this might be something that will be answered after your testimony. So we've been told that PCBs are ubiquitous. We all have them in our bodies. We in health and welfare have been taking a lot of testimony on various chemicals that are put in our bodies, female products for one, on our faces, makeup, clothing, on our lawns. You mentioned food.
Yeah.
They're everywhere. The healthcare issues that you bring up in here are so incredibly triggering. Cancer, endocrine, reproduction, et cetera, et cetera. We immediately sort of jump into this like fight or flight panic mode, for sure. What I didn't see in this packet was a slide that shows the amount of time one has to spend in the exposure. And again, maybe that's coming in an exposed space to have the effects. What science tells us about this. My other question is in terms of air quality. The testing is going in and it's getting a test moment in time. Tell me about air quality fluctuation in the course of an hour, a day, a week, when kids are coming in and out of their classroom. Windows might be going open and closed. Doors are opening and shutting. You might have a ventilation system that's working. Those are my two questions for now.
So cancer effects generally have a fair delay. We call that a latency period that goes on perhaps for decades. But the substance is within you, but the cancer is not. But it can develop over time. The non-cancer effects, we specifically use a 1-year period, time interval, for calculating what's called reasonable exposure. And that's different than what the EPA did, which is used for the average exposure level. We usually factor in the age, the amount of time spent in the setting, time per day, time over a month, time over a year. So these non-cancer effects are really a 1-year kind of issue, much more so than it takes forever to develop this. The air quality business, it's well known that at least at the levels closer to detection, so the lower levels, things are being absorbed and emitted all the time. In terms of the source of the PCBs within a room. So those may fluctuate, which is why we have to give a fair amount of cushion to that detection level at the bottom. But as you get into these higher levels, while they probably will fluctuate and change, they're starting out as higher levels. And so I think that unless a new ventilation system occurred the day after the testing was done, and it would perhaps radically alter the results, it's probably not going to be a difference in saying this is a bad level, even though the magnitude of that may have changed.
Thank you. And I don't know if it's,
I just want to make sure we get to Senator Williams, and we can always come back. Do you want to follow up directly on this?
I would. you
Okay,
mind?
please. No, please go ahead.
Okay.
Yep, and then we'll go to
Um,
Senator Williams.
If you could send us the exposure times that are
Yeah.
scientifically based around cancer and all of the other issues that you brought up, that would be great. But my understanding, for example, is, at least for the cancer, it's something like, I think I'm in the ballpark, 7 hours a day, 6 days a week, 235 days a year for 30 years gives you a 6 in 1 million
Yeah.
possibility. And a lot of our spaces that at least that I've been seeing that have high levels of PCBs are spaces like gyms, auditoriums. I know that there's a kitchen at the Charlotte Elementary School that's
Yes.
closed right now. But the kids aren't in the kitchen, and even the folks who work in there are not in there for very long. So I just really think we need to start talking more about the exposure.
Yeah, no, you make a very fair
I
point.
think it's really, really important. Because my ultimate question is, and I know this is.
Keep in mind, the exposure time related to the age of the kid too.
Yes.
So the preschool kid is going to be very different than the 12th grade.
Absolutely, absolutely. And my last question, which is kind of a big one, and it's hard to quantify, and I understand this, but I do have to ask it, having lived it. And to Senator Campion's point, I know that the chances of us closing down a school at this point is probably very slim. But I did live it, it caused many deleterious effects in my community. And I'm wondering if you can at all speak to, the potential deleterious effects that closing schools, closing parts of schools, requiring more taxpayer funding, staffing in a school district that's already strapped. What kind of effects can this have on our children? Because in an extreme case, given our current mental health crisis, we could be talking about suicide. We could be talking about dropping out of school. In Burlington, it was kids not getting food that they get at school. So big picture, this is a complicated system, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. There are obviously in the category of unanticipated consequences, fallout from anything. The fact that I think it's very, very, very unlikely that school would close really helps that a lot, because then you're dealing with shuffling rooms, or at worst, finding another location in the community for certain school activities that would be disruptive, but wouldn't be as disruptive as stay home, stay safe, or anything like that. So I think, most of this, what year was the act passed? It was,
I think it was about 2 years ago. Oh, you mean for PCB testing?
PCBs.
2021? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, we were still reeling with things, but we hadn't had the whole fallout from what was going on with COVID and seeing of that stuff. So we have to be considerate of those things, for sure. I don't think that's a deal breaker in this case, because I do think the whole thesis of this protocol I presented is meeting schools and communities where they are and trying to be as accommodating as possible, as opposed to as restrictive as possible. It's really erring on the side of being accommodating, as long as we don't get into the duration of exposure that would be harmful.
Senator Williams.
Things that kind of goes right in with what Senator Williams said. You established a point in time, you have a protocol, and we're looking at what we know right now. That school was built in 1970, let's say. And do we have any way that we can gauge when construction was done for a particular, if they find it in the gym, and when was the last construction done in the gym that could have caused that? Probably don't have those records.
I would think I think the schools do, and
Okay.
consultants that are involved in the prioritization schools are aware of that.
Because I was the town health officer in my in my town. And I got a call from a VPER that wanted to know why there are so many cancer cases. And you might be able to use some of this data, and like particularly if it was all the, you know, the basketball team. Right. They all got cancer and they were all, you know, playing in that same gymnasium. It might be good data to try and just break it down a little bit and keep it separate.
Yeah.
And that's all.
Any other questions before we sort of shift to our commissioner? Anything for our Commissioner of Health?
Thank you.
Dr. Levine, sorry, you remaining.
Yeah, I'm gonna hang out.
So I do have a question, but I'd like to hear the next.
Yeah,
testimony.
please. Okay, great. Commissioner.
Stop sharing.
Tough act to follow. I'll do my best. You know, I really do think that Dr. Levine's last slide, to me, really says it all. Positive testing does not stop exposure to harmful chemicals that have known serious health effects. That kind of is our position. We share that view with them. One thing I would also tell you, another reason not to pause, it's working. It's working. You know, there were definitely some hiccups early on. It's the first time anyone has ever done this. Okay, as far as I know, well, definitely in the country, and I'm not sure elsewhere where we're at, but this is the first time anyone had ever tried. So we definitely had some fits and starts to get down the gate. We're doing really well now. We're on target to meet the July 2025 deadline to test all the schools, over 320 schools. So I feel like we're doing a good job. The results, you know, I don't want to say alarming, but they're informative. You know, we're finding PCBs in a number of schools. We've been doing testing since June 2022. We've got test results available. That means a lot. It means you haven't just collected, you've gone through the whole process of getting the lab to validate, et cetera. So out of 31 samples, 10 have exceeded the school action. That's not insignificant. As Dr. Levine just mentioned, we just had one last week. So we're continuing to test, we're continuing to find. So from where we sit, we're doing what we were told to do. And I think we're doing a good job of it. We're working very hard with schools to try to keep them open. That was always part of the mission here. You know, I want to recognize we're coming out of COVID, you know, the reflexive thing, you could say, it's in a school, shut it down, right? That doesn't, you know, I don't think even pre-COVID that would have gone over great. Now that we know the impacts of school closings, we don't want to do that. It's going to take something very extreme, which we haven't even come close to seeing to get us there. We can do this, and we can keep kids safe. We can get, and not just kids. Let's remember, there's lots of people who work in schools for a long, long time. So we have to worry about them. Granted, the levels are higher for adults, but they also work there a lot longer. They're there a lot longer. So, you know, we need to be protective of both the students and the staff. So we do feel like we're making the progress that we've been asked to make. And one thing I'll mention, you mentioned the school in Charlotte where the kitchen had to close. Well, they installed a carbon filtration system and they were able to get the levels down to non-detect. So they're able to reopen that kitchen. So that's an example. So Dr. Levine mentioned mitigation versus remediation. There's a lot of things you can do to mitigate this problem. You don't have to get the source out right away. Eventually, you always want to get the source out, but you can prevent these exposures and allow for timeframes that make sense for schools to work within that timeframe. We're not sitting there saying, you got to do this next week, so get all the kids out of here. So there's time. You know, you can move to different places. You can use, you know, either filtration systems. There's certain types of paint that are effective. So there's a lot of methodologies that can be used to keep the people in the building safe until we get to the point where we get it out of here. That's always our goal. I mean, our goal is to get these things out of the environment. But in the interim, we recognize this is a sensitive population and a sensitive issue. And we planned it. We built this thing with the health department and with the education to come up with a way that we can try to balance all these challenges. And there's always people who are going to be unhappy and frustrated, and I understand that. No one likes to hear that there's poison in their school. It's not good news. So, we try to work with them and help them understand, what it means, what the risks are. So we get, health helps us understand the effects. We manage the risk. That's our job. And so our job is eventually to eliminate the risk. But in the interim, we're very willing and able to work with schools to make these things work.
Questions for the commissioner? Yes, Senator.
So just out of curiosity, maybe to address Senator Gould's question. So I just completed a radon test in my home, which I think was from one of your departments. That was a year-long test. And to your point, it just sat there and, come and go and what have you. But for the PCB test, is it a 1 hour test, like a sniffer, or is it a long-term test? Just kind of give us a sense of the rollout, how long this rollout takes.
So, I'm just the commissioner. I don't do the testing, but I have my expert who actually knows all these things on Teams chat right now. So I'm hoping to see a little typing symbol, but I will be able to tell you that.
Can I also say to you that there was, I think WCAX did a little expose on the testing. They actually showed some of the folks who do the testing in the rooms with their machine that they use, and I mean, I can try to find that and send it to you, but that was really actually kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So, and I'm talking about, I remember, because I used to help the janitor.
Yeah.
It's kind of my detention help.
Oh, when you were a kid.
Oh, yeah. when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And they used to put down a compound on the floors. He'd go and spread it around, then he used a big dust mop that kind of cleaned the floor. That might be something that had PCBs in it.
I just got my
And
answer.
it smelled good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
used it.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
It's 24 hour testing.
24 hours.
Yeah, they use a pump attached to a PUF filter. Don't ask me what a PUF filter. The sample's collected for 24 hours.
Senator Gould.
Thank you so much, and Dr. Levine, both of you for your work. And we all want to keep our kids and our staff safe. That is so incredibly important. But again, I can't say enough how much our schools are already struggling, and I just hate to make things harder for them. We have fewer teachers going into the profession than ever before. And I feel like every time we make their job harder, it is harmful. It is harmful. So I'm just going to leave that. I want to get back to the action levels and the immediate action levels. And I am so happy to hear about Charlotte, by the way. Thank you for letting me know. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I just thought that.
Yeah, that's great. So I assume when you come up with these levels, 30 to 100, excuse me, for action level, and then 90 for 300 for the immediate action levels, you are taking into account the space and how much it's being used or accessed. Is that correct?
That's really more for.
Okay. So immediate action level, if a school has a 95 in their gym, for example, and the gym is only used by kids maybe 3 times a week for an hour for 180 days a year, is that part of the equation? Is that when you came up with this 90?
Right, so it's not part of the equation, but it's part of the grid on what do you do about it?
Okay.
Which option do you take?
Okay.
So I could see that school taking the option that gives them a whole year and lets the gym be occupied as it normally is, as long as the students are of the right age, because I would think a preschool student would not be in that gym.
Okay.
Not that they would be anyways, but we're sure it was for the right age population.
Great.
But it didn't determine how the level, it's not in reverse.
Okay, great.
Levels came first.
Yeah.
That actually brings to mind a real life example. We had a school where it was an elementary school classroom. Were at levels where they couldn't be in the classroom, but they were low enough that older kids could be. And so we basically just had them switch classrooms. We're still able to keep the kids safe, keep them in school, albeit in little different rooms, but hopefully definitely not as disruptive as having them, have to go someplace completely different than a classroom.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And so Do you advise, did you advise Charlotte, for example, on that air filtration system? Who's the entity that did that?
Most likely it was their consultant, but I'm sure we were involved. I'm sure we would have worked with the consulting firm to help them with that. We worked very closely.
Great.
My staff works very closely with the school's consultants, and they kind of problem solve and figure these things out.
Wonderful, because it does seem as though with the air levels, there can be, mitigation can be probably fairly simple and also very on target. And
It depends, but there are, that's a good example. That one, that's
Yeah.
relatively easy, great elements like that. But some spaces are bigger, it's harder to identify. It also sounds like, I forgot to mention, I think they might have found a source there. They found a capacitor in that room, and they took it out. And so they're gonna go back and do some sampling and see if you can need the filtration. But, everyone is a little different. Every scenario is a little bit different. But yeah, there are potential scenarios where the mitigation is pretty straightforward, and we keep everybody safe and not have to do anything too disruptive.
great. Can I ask either of you two to comment on the amount that is currently set aside for funding? Is it adequate? And second question is how do you, I'm not sure you can answer this, but how do you feel about the 80-20 split?
On the funding, all I can really tell you is I'm not aware of anyone seeking additional funds at this time. I will tell you, I would be very surprised if that 30 million ends up being sufficient based upon what we've seen to date, but I'm not aware of any specific asks at this point in time. In terms of the 80-20 split, it's really based upon our approach to brownfields, if we're with brownfields. So when we have brownfields projects, that's the typical split between kind of not the school's private, but for non-state entities, pay 20% and the state pays 80%. So that was really where it originated, and so that's where we're at with that.
Yes, please.
So certainly drawbacks and benefits to being the first in the nation to pursue any kind of program, certainly programs affecting students and staff in schools. But given the cost of potential remediation of the problem, I'm still struggling with to justify to constituents the difference between Vermont's levels of acceptable exposures and the EPA's levels. How can we bring the two together? So, what we do here is essentially can be mirrored by other states, but not to drain the treasury of the state at a time when it's difficult to afford.
So, I'll let Dr. Levine talk to the more technical aspects. I can tell you from a regulatory perspective. So I did work at EPA for a number of years, and so I have a sense of how their system works. It's much slower than ours. You're probably not surprised. I'll just give you an example. Dr. Levine mentioned in 2016 when we found PFAS in Bennington, EPA was at 400 ppt. Right? We did a lot of work. We got to 20. We had an emergency rule passed. We cleaned it up. Just this month, EPA announced that there's MCLs for the two primary PFAS compounds that we find in our state, PFOA and PFOS, is 4 parts per trillion. So just to give you a sense of the dynamic, right? So in 7 years, 100-fold, like that. So, I think they're a little bit behind us, is my sense. We're just on top of this. This has been known since 2013 is the first publication I could find from EPA indicating that PCBs, indoor air emissions from PCBs are dangerous. The state set its first levels in 2014. So I just feel like Vermont, and if you look at Dr. Levine has a slide indicating various lawsuits, there's a lot going on out there, and I feel like it's a good reflection on us. We're getting out ahead of it. There's people getting sick. And so I'm comfortable with these folks setting levels that I believe are protected under the health of Dr. Levine.
Yeah, you did a wonderful job of answering that question. And if you just look at the PFAS compounds, you look at the lead in the drinking water. It's good to be ahead of the game when you're science-based. Again, we're not cowboys just willy-nilly doing things. These are very science-based decisions. These are well accepted in the toxicology community. but it takes a lot of effort to move policy at the national level and regulatory structures at the national level. And I think we're a little more facile in being able to do that. But again, I hate to give the answer to you to tell your constituents just have faith, but look at experience and look at the track record and look at the fact that we actually can justify every decision we've made in terms of why we included the number of hours, the number of days, the number of years. All of those factors going into the formulas that are used to decide where a level should be. And again, what level of risk is a constituent willing to assume? Most people would look at 1 in a million or 6 in a million and go, well, I don't want to be that 1 or that 6, but that doesn't sound so bad. But that's really where the field of toxicology is in looking at things. And we don't want to make a departure from that and say, we'll go an order of magnitude difference. So 60 people per million is acceptable in Vermont. That would not be acceptable. So we have to really be data and science driven all the way.
Are there any levers that our federal delegation can pull to get the EPA to, to have a conversation? I mean, it just seems like there's a very expensive disconnect.
Every state is watching closely what happens here and want us to share our findings with them. So just the findings alone, never mind what's done with the findings, just the findings alone, I think are going to have an impact. So your question may be a little premature. We need to let our data accumulate and then show it to the world and get them to see what they think. And they can critically appraise it, just like anything else that's scientifically published.
Maybe just give you a little more regulatory context as opposed to more science-based context. If you call the EPA, so EPA, they have something called the removals program, which deals with kind of imminent hazards, like bad stuff, right? You call them at, if they went to a school in Vermont and found levels at 5, they would consider that an imminent hazard and they would take immediate action. So just to give you a sense, they're not saying that we're too high, it's just they have a different construct than we do. I think ours is frankly more thought out than theirs.
Thank you.
And this committee, frankly, I mean, we have the chief health officer, an environmental officer, and the governor saying, don't pause. So this committee has to decide whether or not it wants to fight that, get a possible veto. I mean, I have to sort of get a really, and say 6 months, again, to me, at least from what I've heard, 6 months is just going to pick back up again. So what I would hate to see happen, just as the chair, is testimony, and we all end up still having a majority of the committee saying, hey, we're not going to pause. So I just want us to keep that in mind, given that April 1st is soon, and we have got a lot of work to do. Senator Doolittle.
I would just like to end with, I'm not necessarily in favor of pausing. I would like to hear more from the folks in the know how this program is going to play with our school construction bill, because that's a really, really actually critical conversation. And so any advice you have, thoughts?
And if I may, I think one of the things Senator Doolittle is rightfully focused on also is the funding piece. I mean, how is there something that we did write to our federal delegation? We're kind of hammering it home as much as we can with them. We know Vermont's starting this, but everybody's going to do it. How can we do it? And then I also, Senator Schumacher.
Just wanted to close by saying, I mean, in my personal life, I defer to my doctor when I get medical advice. When it comes to toxicology, most of the time, I want to defer to the commissioner here. But then there's also the piece of, trying to put myself, well, I am a dad of a 12-year-old, but thinking about the other parents who are sending their kids to school and then seeing that this testing is going to be potentially paused. That makes me uncomfortable, and I imagine it would also make other parents uncomfortable. And then there's also the piece that was mentioned earlier, that this PCB testing can inform the school construction process. And my opinion is that these aren't two separate things. And lastly, the 80-20 situation, the funding for this, that, I mean, when I talked to my the superintendent in Wyndham County, that was one of his concerns as well. And I think that's going to be the challenge, at least in my opinion, the funding part is going to be the challenge for this.
So I do have a slide that I'll just send to the committee assistant, but
That'd be
just to
terrific.
talk you through it. I mean, one of the key factors here is when I was talking about mitigation, if we can prevent these exposures, there's a fair amount of flexibility within that time frame. As long as the kids and the staff aren't being exposed, the actual remediation, which is when the construction piece comes in, right? You could do mitigation measures like air filters or just paint and stuff. That's not going to disrupt the construction schedule. There are ways to try to make things more aligned. You may not be perfect, right? If they're talking 10 years from now, but I would never be comfortable waiting 10 years to fix the problem. But if it's within reason, if you take, there's something called a corrective action plan that can kind of set things out. As long as we've got the exposures under control, there should be ways to mitigate some of that effort. I get that. The school doesn't want to go out and renovate a wing because of PCBs and come back a year later and do the same thing. So there is some flexibility within reason built in here, as long as we make sure that the people in the building are safe. I'll shoot that over to the staff.
Any other questions or comments for either our witnesses? It's been very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both
Appreciate
for
it.
everything you're doing. Great, thank you. Okay, any other final, went a little over. Looks like tomorrow, the floor is gonna also run another couple hours, so. Yeah, 1 to 3. So we'll be in here from 3 to about 4:30. Yeah, back there.
Okay, you're,
I can do that.
Thank you both,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Great of you to come in.
I've got 5 pages.
Yeah, I bet you